Can we have, would you be comfortable here, sir? Okay, and we'll give him a mic, and for the audience as well.
Okay, so that was a excellent painting on a very broad and long canvas. So I would request you to once again put your hands together and give him an ovation for a... Okay, so I think one of the important message that he left us with, besides the message of optimism and hope resting on your shoulders, he also in the course of his remarks pointed out that the government alone cannot be an island or a center of excellence if the rest of the society isn't. He talked about how China began with agricultural sector in its economic reform process, whereas India has not been able to because inefficient sectors cannot become leaders of reforms because they don't like competition. He also mentioned the fact that we citizens wear two hats, consumer and producer. As consumers we want choice, as producer we want protection. So then the government will also be exactly formulating policies in that vein. And also he pointed out to us that state governments control a vast portion of the GDP, and bulk of the reforms that are still yet to happen are in the domain of state governments. And what questions do we ask of some of these areas? How much are we aware of the judicial reform process and the pending cases, etc.? So in the course of talking us through from £3 allotment for his foreign exchange for his trip to London to the situation where all of us can look forward to a bright future, he also told us that there are no rights without responsibilities. And that is something which as youngsters you need to take away with you from this speech of his. And he also said at the very beginning that whatever questions he doesn't have the time to answer, it was very kind of him to say Anant would answer. I was wondering how would it be possible, but I'm encouraged by one fact, that one common thing that we share. All the watches that I have are also only Titan watches. So at least on that basis, I can confidently say I may be able to take some of the questions which he doesn't answer. So with that, I'm going to throw the floor open. So one important thing, you don't get to make a speech in the guise of asking a question, okay? That's already been done. So keep your questions crisp and short, say your name, and be very clear to the extent that the person who receives the question knows what exactly you want the answer for. So there are some mics around. So the first question, please say your name, and is there any mic for him? So people hold.
Akash from the Department of Humanities and Social Sciences. My question was that you talked about our per capita income, which you correctly mentioned is average productivity of Indians. So taking it from there, in order to increase the average productivity, what we would need is to reform our education system and the way we do skill development. So what's the government planning on that front? Maybe deregulation or anything in that regard?
See, education is a continuum. There is the school education, there is the vocational education, and there is the higher education. These are not neat silos, one spills over into another. But presumably your question was about higher education, presumably. Now, so far as the higher education is concerned, the terminal goal is fairly clear. That you want to break down the silos that exist in regulating higher education today. You want to have an unified regulator. And you want to make sure that regulation is proper regulation, because the importance is not just saying there's a regulator, but the content of that regulation. You want to ensure that that regulation is about disclosure of information and is not about licensing in the guise of regulation. For instance, I want to know, I'm using IIT as an example, nothing more than that. I want to know what IIT's faculty's credentials are. What is the publication record? What is the citation record? What are the sources for revenue? What is it being spent on? Many institutes of education, higher education in India, and one should not use IIT as an example, are not transparent. There are some which are even shady. I would also like for higher education, this is my view now, it is not the government's view, not yet. I would also like government funding of education to be directed to individual students and not be in the form of unrealistic fees that are artificially low across the board. Because higher education is a maze, one has to move gradually. There is no big bang, steady state. So therefore, what the government has been doing is gradual incremental movements. And also remember, it is a maze because there are state universities, there are central universities, there are unitary universities, and worst of all, there are affiliating universities. So therefore, one has to move gradually.
Good evening, sir. I'm Vignesh Kumar. This is about the agricultural subsidy. Actually, how can we level the same the farmers in resource rich area and resource constrained area? We giving subsidy to both in the same rate. How it is fair?
Did you understand?
Not quite.
Actually, we are giving a subsidy to the every farmers.
Okay.
Actually, in some area the resource like water, the minerals are rich in some areas. In some areas the resource is very low. How can we see the same?
How can we have equal subsidies
equal subsidy to
for
the
all,
resource constrained farmers
for all
and
areas which could be?
Yeah.
Okay. So the subsidies are equal across all farmers, but some are better endowed with resources and some are not. So how can it be one subsidy fits all?
As students, I would like you to ask even more fundamental questions. Who is a farmer? You are taking that for granted. Who is a farmer? The definition of a farmer varies from state to state. Quite often the definition of a farmer is linked to the nature of the land, agricultural land. As students, I would like you to ask, today in India, do we have an inventory of land? Who owns what land? What are the antecedents of that land? Which requires a matching of revenue records with survey records with modern technology like satellite imagery and whatever. I'm sure you will be surprised to know that there are states in India where the last land surveys were done in the year 1908. So first, let's understand who's a farmer. Let's get the land market record straight. Then we can ask about the nature of subsidy. What is subsidy? A subsidy is also resources, trade-off of resources. If I am giving you a subsidy through a lower price for the input that you pay, that is money that I could have spent on building a rural road. Which one is better? It is also a documented fact that most of our subsidies are on on the input side. It is also a documented fact that, subject to what I said about the definition of a farmer, most of these input subsidies benefit larger farmers. But to ensure that I do something, I need a consensus across states. Such and such person is a farmer. And I need a comprehensive program to ensure the land records are up to date. Since 88, 89, the union government has had a scheme on computerization of land records. In states like Karnataka, the states also where the land records are good, in fact even Andhra and Telangana, it's helped. In states where the surveys are old, it is garbage in and garbage out.
There's a question there, and then we come back here.
Okay.
Yeah, first near the exit. Yeah.
So my name is Nandakumar and I'm an entrepreneur. So one of the points I think which is very, very important from your lecture was that states have a lot of role to play going forward, be it land, labor, or whatever. Given our polity, how do you think that's going to be possible, and what do you think the central government is going to be doing to get all these states on board to deliver on that?
I thought I had already answered part of the question when I referred to the GST Council. But let me put it to you like this. I mentioned the centrally sponsored schemes. In the Planning Commission days, who decided on the centrally sponsored schemes? The Planning Commission did. This basket of centrally sponsored schemes was determined by a group of chief ministers. This particular one chaired by Shivraj Singh Chauhan, who was then the Chief Minister of Madhya Pradesh. In his first term, Narendra Modi as Prime Minister set up 3 groups of Chief Ministers. One on the centrally sponsored schemes, the second one on skill development, the third one on the Swachh Bharat mission. Every Chief Minister was a member of one or the other of these. So, particularly under this government, one is witnessing an institutional change where India, many developmental economists have argued, has been excessively centralized. This is for the first time that one has witnessed decentralization and devolution, including fiscal devolution through the 14th Finance Commission. It would have been very tempting, given the pay commission, given various other things, for the union government to say that 32% will become 37%, we will look at the 42% later on. But what I think all of us need to do is use the word center. Please stop using the word center. The word center is not there in our constitution. The word in our constitution is union government. And one of the things that's happened since 2014 is that the union government has recognized this is a union government. It is not a center.
Question here?
May I?
No, you already asked the question, right?
I didn't. No, I'm waiting to ask the question.
Okay.
Yeah, thanks. So, sir, I'm just curious to know when the government actually had this sudden realization that growth happens in the states and the per capita numbers are dependent on the people, and there is no more center and we only have the union government, because whatever the government has done over the last 6 years seems contrary to what you're speaking right now, because most of it has been brash reforms, centralized decision making, somebody saying this is what the rest of the nation has to do and stuff like that. So I'm curious to understand when this happened, because until recently we were still talking about 5 trillion economy, and you just said that
But where I gave you
anything more than
illustrations, right?
I'm sorry? Yeah.
I just illustrations.
Yeah, no, but I'm saying, when did the government...
Are you asking a question or are you saying something? Which,
No, no, I'm asking you, when did the government actually have this realization that, wow, it's the states of the people who have to contribute?
well, the government does not use the word wow. I've never heard the PM use the word wow. But this is precisely what has been happening since May 2014. I gave you the instance of the Planning Commission, I gave you the instance of the GST Council, I gave you the example of the way the centrally sponsored schemes were fashioned.
So is it almost an apology, right?
Sorry?
It's almost an apology by the government for what has happened in the last 6 years, isn't it?
What is an apology?
The sudden change in stance.
Whose change in stance?
The government's change in stance, that it is
For-
the people and the states who have to contribute.
Wait a minute. When was Niti Aayog formed? 1st January.
Yeah.
Were these groups set up? These groups were set up in April of 2015. It is not a sudden realization. A realization in 2015. So unless my maths is horribly wrong, from 2015 to 2019 is more than 4 years. So why are you saying it's a sudden realization now?
Because until recently, it was
Yeah.
not. No, his question. Do you want me to respond to his question?
Response to what? I've just contradicted you.
Yeah, I'm just trying to.
So I've given you evidence. So give me counter evidence.
I'm trying to unravel the contradiction. If
Hmm?
you want. Do you want me to unravel the contradiction if you want?
I've given you evidence, you have to give me counter evidence.
Do you want me to?
Yes.
Until recently, the Prime Minister.
Don't repeat what you said. Give me
I'm
evidence.
giving you evidence from the Prime Minister's office,
What?
where he says we are looking at a 5 trillion economy.
No, that is
Now,
That's
if he
an aspiration.
truly understands the state of things that you just mentioned, when you said anything above 8% is ruled out, and he is fully aware of that.
Sorry, say that again.
If you just said that 6% to 8% is realistic, anything above 8% is completely out of the picture.
I did not exactly say that.
You
I didn't say that.
just said
I think you, I'm sure it has been recorded.
Yeah.
Listen carefully to the replay.
No, but you said anything above 8% is fanciful, is what you said.
so I think
No,
probably-
don't try and put words in my mouth.
So you're saying we can grow above 8%?
Not even words like wow.
So I think we should move on to other questions. Yeah. I think the same row. There was one more gentleman.
Good evening, sir. My name is Nayan. I'm from Madras Christian College. I have a bit of technical question on economics. Like a few months back, I was reading the newspaper, Hindu. I was reading the business article, and there was an article like government is rethinking the plan on removing the capping on FDI to make it 100% in some sectors. So my question is that in 1997 and 1998, like the Asian financial crisis happened, and one of the main reasons for that was 100% FDI in these CMLB countries. So are we endangering ourselves to exposing ourselves to 100% FDIs?
FDI is not as volatile as portfolio investments. So assuming I'm going to get capital inflows, it is desirable that the capital inflows come in the form of FDI, because they cannot leave at the drop of a hat. It's been consistent government policy since 91 to therefore encourage FDI. In varying degrees, it has always been a movement forward. So far as the East Asian crisis is concerned, the East Asian crisis, one can have different diagnoses, but it was not because of FDI. Nothing to do with FDI.
So I just realized that the ladies in the auditorium haven't asked any questions yet. So since he has time only for a couple of more questions, he has to leave for the airport. Is there anybody who wants to break the fact that we haven't had any questions from ladies in the audience? So I would like to give preference to them first. Nobody comes forward? Okay. So there is a question Pratik, here. This gentleman in the blue shirt, and then last question here in the first row, and then we will close. Yeah.
Good evening, sir. My name is Kaushik from TRF, Tamilagam Research Foundation. I have two questions regarding judicial reforms. Do you see any judicial reforms happening, especially for enforcement of contracts, apart from the IBC? And my second question is, we know that India is a consumption-driven economy, and especially rural consumption. Will devolving more funds for Narega help revive the economy from that slowdown?
See, Narega is essentially demand driven. So let's not use Narega as an example, because Narega is demand driven. If there's less demand for Narega, it actually is a good thing, because people do not need Narega. One of the things that I did not say, paucity of time, is that without saying wow, since May 2014, one of the things that the government has done is focus on the rural sector. Whether it is LPG, electricity, road connectivity, toilets, electricity connections. One should not confuse what has been happening in the rural sector with what has been happening in agriculture. Rural sector is much more than agriculture. If one is looking at the temporary slowdown is, to my mind, largely driven by what has happened to construction, which is a major source of employment for unskilled and semi-skilled labor. My diagnosis is that give it another 2 quarters and you will see the rural consumption begin to recover. Judicial reforms. This is a tough one, not a tough one to answer. It's a tough one to answer because it takes a lot of time to answer this properly. So far as union government is concerned, there is something called LIMS, which you will not have heard of, not that it is a great secret, but people don't always visit government websites. You'll find it on the Union Government Law Ministry's website. What LIMS has tried to do, this is judicial in an extrapolated sense, is to cut down on union government legislation. But your substantive question was about really the criminal side. There's the Civil Procedure Code in 2001-2002, the Atal Bihari Vajpayee government, which was expected to reduce the average duration of a civil dispute to 1.5 years. Didn't happen because of a judicial pronouncement, which I'm sure you know about. Your question is really about the criminal side, and the criminal side, the substantive law, you mentioned IPC, but there is also the Indian Evidence Act, there's also the Criminal Procedure Code, and there are the procedural improvements which happen independent of this. This, because it involves the judiciary, and 2/3 of cases are criminal cases, mostly concentrated in lower courts. I can give you a little bit of examples of this happening, that happening, not on the legislation, but procedural improvements, video conferencing has happened, under trials have been released, but they have not been very systematic. So I would interpret your question as a statement that, hey, look, once upon a time the Malimat committee submitted its recommendations. Is it time to revisit that? And my answer would be yes. But here we are talking about government in a broader sense because it involves the judiciary.
Last question.
My name is Sundareshan, Friday Micro Ventures. I'm going to ask a question on micro enterprises. The question is, what in your view, the micro enterprises' strength, weakness, opportunity and threat to our economy in 5 years, 10 years and 20 years? Thank you.
This is so difficult a question, I shall leave it for Anant to answer.
No, I thought there were 12 questions here. If you do a matrix, micro enterprises and then 5, 10, 15, so it's equivalent to almost 12 questions.
The SWOT of micro enterprises.
Yeah. So
I'm sure you can do it much better than either Anantha or
I think he has proposed a topic for the next Narasimha Rao Memorial Lecture. So I think I would like to. No, it is really, I think, a very vast question in terms of the strengths, weaknesses, and opportunities and the threats that they face in a short, medium, and long-term horizon. So that's, I think, I don't dismiss the importance of the question, but I think it's a fairly involved question to be able to answer in the short time that he has. So.
Okay. Well, I will ask you a question.
Please.
Anantha and I, we use similar watches. We do not use similar pens. I like fountain pens. I like cheaper fountain pens. Why is it the case that the Chinese can produce decent fountain pens for 150 rupees? I'm not talking about the fancy German pens and French pens, and India cannot. Now, before you tell me the Chinese have all kinds of artificial subsidies, why is it the Japanese can produce 40,000 rupees pens and can also produce 150 rupees pens? Why is it that once upon a time we were in a position to produce these pens, but we cannot? I think if you answer this question, you will have the entire SWOT of Indian micro-enterprise.
So thank you very much. I think that draws the greatest importance to the economy in the future. That's what I want. Thank you.
I think the point is well taken, but I think this is a topic for another occasion. So I think with that, we have to bring down the curtains on this memorable afternoon for all of us when we had the opportunity to hear 30 years of economic change in this country compressed into a 1-hour lecture. So on your behalf and on my personal behalf, I would like to thank him for his presence and for his excellent oration. Thank you very much, Dr. Debroy.
Please be seated. Please be seated. Please be seated, sir. Just a few minutes. Felicitations. I request Professor Das to first felicitate our chief guest, Mr. Debroy, for responding affirmatively. On the first instance, we sent him the invitation to come and deliver the second P.V. Narasimha Rao Economic Development Memorial Lecture. So may I request the volunteers to please bring the memento, and Professor Das will give him on behalf of Tamil Nadu Young Thinkers Forum and Department HSS IIT Madras. Professor Das. May I subsequently request Professor Das to also felicitate Dr. Anantha Nageswaran. Thank you, sir, for ably moderating it, setting the context. And on our behalf, we'd like to felicitate Professor Das. I request Ram, one of our members, to felicitate Professor Das for being considerate with us in supporting this second Tamil Nadu Economic Policy Dialogue. Thank you so much. Friends, we'll break for today. It's been a fascinating inaugural session. Tomorrow at 9:30, we have another distinguished speaker with us, Dr. Anbumani Ramadas, Member of Parliament of Rajya Sabha currently. We will start on time like today, but there will be registration processes tomorrow. So 8:30, we request you to please come and assemble at the same venue. Seating will be on a first-come, first-served basis. We will register, speak to your college coordinators, and enable your entry into this auditorium. And we start at 9:30 a.m. sharp. Thank you so much. See you tomorrow. Thank you.